1775, April 19th. Good day, students. Buenos dias, los estudiantes. My name is John Chamberlain, and I am the Historical Hustler. Thank you all for watching today. Thank you that have been watching on both sides of the Mississippi here in the United States. And first thing you want to know about this video is it's sponsored by nobody, not Radio Shack, not Toys R Us. Rest in peace to those businesses, by the way. So we're gonna get right into the material today. It's about the battles of Lexington and Concord, the events that happened on April 19th, 1775, and some of the events that happened the evening before in order to give notice to the Continental Minutemen, militiamen scattered throughout Massachusetts and the surrounding areas. So let's go ahead and let's start from the night before on April 18th. A gentleman, a doctor, a member of the Sons of Liberty, Dr. Joseph Warren, was notified that the British were going to be marching on Lexington and Concord. Now, the purpose of going to Lexington was to arrest John Adams and to arrest John Hancock because they were hiding out from the British, like Al Capone at the Hawthorne Hotel in Chicago. Now, luckily, they were notified. We'll talk about that in just a second. And the second part of the British mission was to go to Concord and seize the ammunitions, and the weapons that could be turned against them. You know, they knew that this revolution was going to happen. There was going to be, there was going to be blood spilled. So they wanted to make sure that the Continental Army and the colonists, the Minutemen, didn't have access to these munitions. So that was the purpose of the British journey, right? The mission, the whole point there. So they were, the doctor notified two writers originally out of Boston, Paul Revere and William Dawes. And they left from Boston and Charlestown, and they were notified, you know, the story about the lantern above the church. There's a poem that goes with it. And I'd like to share that poem with you right now, if you don't mind. So this poem is from a gentleman by the name of Henry Wadsworth. And it's called Paul Revere's Ride. One by land and two by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. It's a very fantastic piece of American literature right there about Paul Revere's Ride. So thank you to the gentleman that wrote that back during those times. So back to the night there, after the Dawes and Revere reached Lexington, right? They warned Adams, and Hancock told him, "We better get out of here, man. The British are coming." And one of the things that people say, the reason I said that is people think that they were saying the British were coming, the British were coming. They were riding through towns and villages saying this. It's actually incorrect. They weren't saying that. In fact, they weren't yelling at all. This was a mission of discreet. They wanted to not draw a lot of attention to themselves. That way they were scared they were going to get caught. They also weren't saying the British were coming because nobody knew what they would be talking about. Everybody considered themselves British. So the fact that it's one of those misconceptions in history that we have. So I wanted to make sure we got that ironed out right now before we continued on. So after Adams and Hancock skinned out, they left. They went away from the British. Obviously, they didn't want to be hanged for treason and such. And the British were moving, obviously, towards Concord. So they wanted to go there as well and warn the people. They met another writer by the name of Samuel Prescott. And Prescott actually made it to Concord. Revere did not. Dawes did not. Revere got caught by a British patrol. Dawes got thrown from his horse and had to walk back, right? So if it wasn't for Samuel Prescott, I'm assuming that the people of Concord would have been caught off guard. So after Prescott gets there to Concord, we know the story about how people started to prepare and started to take the munitions and start moving weapons and things like that around and hiding, which was very smart. But we don't know the story. There were two other writers in the month of April that actually went and warned people throughout the countryside of the British intentions of what they were doing. the other rider, another gentleman's name was Israel Bissell. He was a postal rider and actually rode 345 miles total. This was in earlier April, though, when we knew the British intentions, and he rode this postal route. And he started somewhere in mid-April, April 13th, April 15th. It's tough to get records then. Another rider, which is really interesting here, is a lady, 16-year-old girl, a daughter of a colonel. Her name is Sybil Ludington. That's right. She rode 40 miles, twice the distance of Paul Revere, throughout Connecticut, and warned the citizens throughout the Connecticut towns and villages that the British were intending to march there as well. So there are other people in history, sometimes we don't give credit where credit is due. So that's the information about the actual march towards Lexington and Concord and how the residents were warned there. So on dawn, basically, in Lexington, 700 British soldiers showed up there, and they were met by roughly around 77 militiamen. And we get into this, what we call a historical idiom, because in history we have these little slogans, little sayings that we use to remember events. It's called the shot heard around the world. When I was a little kid, I thought somebody busted the biggest gun and you could hear it around the entire world. So sometimes don't be confused by these things, right? But people, they say they don't know who shot. I'll give you my theory, right? The British were the most well-trained, well-disciplined, highly organized, effective logistical maneuvering fighting force the world ever seen at this time in history. Their training, their discipline was incredible. They're not going to fire without having an order. The order that their commander gave was for the Minutemen to lay down their arms. And there is information out there, accounts that say the militiamen commanders, they call them the Minutemen because they could get ready in a minute, right? Not because they could only last a minute in battle. So they were there, their commander supposedly told them to put down their arms. We don't know this for a fact, but somebody shot. I guarantee it was one of the colonialists. Somebody might have been scared, you get nervous, you do stupid things, right? Somebody might have been an instigator, wanted to get this party started. So you got to consider that too. Fear and courage and bravery and some of that stuff, it's a very fine line. So somebody might have fired without wanting to fire. Somebody might have fired accidental discharge, but somebody might have done it just to fire, just to get the war started. But whoever fired, I guarantee was an American. I can guarantee that. So after this, the Americans suffered, I think, 9 wounded and 8 dead. The British had 1 injured, and the militiamen scattered and started convening on Concord, which around 2,500 militiamen went to Concord, and the British arrived there. The militiamen actually took refuge outside the city, and they thought that the British were actually going to burn the town down. So the British were just looking for weapons. They spent 4 hours there and found nothing. So they ended up basically leaving, starting to march 18 miles back to Boston, which was a very, very, very foolish idea at that time. They had to get all the way back, and in 18 miles marching, most people can't do that. I guarantee that, especially not with a full load of gear, the weapons, the ammunition. So right away, these Minutemen, militiamen, started firing upon the British as they were advancing. But the difference here was they weren't standing out in the open field and trading fire with them. They were firing behind covered positions. And because they were firing behind covered positions, they did not expose themselves to a lot of the intense counterattacking and counterfire from the British. The British actually did a fantastic job covering the retreat militarily, if you ask me. I think they lost around 250 people total, casualties, 18-mile march, roughly around 3,500 militiamen firing at them along this way. They must have done a fantastic job. I think they used flanking maneuvers and using cannon fire actually to get back. Total numbers here is basically, I want to say 250 total for the British, wounded, killed, around 70 to 90 for the Americans. So a lot of the tactics that the Americans used, they developed those tactics fighting against Native Americans and Also, these were same tactics that were used hunting. You know, you don't want to give away your position. You fire behind something where nobody can see. Now, the only difference is the Americans were firing behind cover. So if whatever they were behind got hit, they wouldn't get hit too. So they were pretty smart in that regard. Some other things they need to improve later on, but we're going to get into that in just a second. So I do want to share another story about one of those heroes of the Revolution that a lot of people don't talk about. His name is Samuel Whitmore. This guy was roughly around, I want to see 70 years old, 67 years old, really old. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He fought against Pontiac. He was in those old wilderness campaigns fighting against the French and Native Americans and going back to the 1740s. And he knew what was going on. You could hear shots in the distance, and they knew the British were retreating past to his farm. So he went out and he got two musket pistols actually, and then he got his musket and he got a saber. It was like some kind of ceremonial saber, not really something you want to use in battle. And as the British column approached his farm on the way back to Boston, he hid behind a stone wall and popped out and attacked. He shot one instantly with his musket, killed a British soldier, dropped his musket, pulled out his two pistols, shot another British soldier, killed him, shot another one and killed him. Then he pulled out his sword, and he was instantly shot in the face by the British, and then they bayoneted him a bunch of times to the lungs and left him there for dead. They weren't going to stay there and bury him or anything like that. Well, they actually fixed him. A doctor in the area fixed him, and he lived ripe old age in his 90s. So it's one of those stories you really don't hear about the Revolution. That's why I love studying this event, because it was an event that affected everybody, and it was a true underdog story. And we fought shoulder to shoulder, not segregated. We were not a segregated army in a Revolutionary War. We ended up later on, unfortunately, becoming a segregated army all the way until the Korean War. Harry Truman desegregated our armed forces in 1948. So that's what's cool about the Revolution. We were shoulder to shoulder, brother to brother, black, white, Hispanic, didn't matter. Everybody had the same goal. So that's a cool thing about learning about this war. So let's get into the final analysis and wrap up this lesson for today. Final analysis on the British side, out of 700, they lost about 250, right? They made some mistakes. They vastly underestimated their opponent. They lacked key knowledge of the terrain. They demonstrated tactical proficiency by basically covering your rear guard and minimizing your casualties. They abandoned equipment in haste. That's a bad sign. You don't do that. The mission was a total failure for the British. In fact, they got lucky that the Continental militiamen were not a little bit more aggressive, because if they were a little bit more aggressive, they decided to engage more, they could have really chewed the British forces up, and the British could have lost 600-700 men on that day. On the American side, they lost about 90. They had about around 3,500 fighting total. Right, they used unconventional tactics, which is very smart, and were very effective fighting a force, especially like the British. And this is something that's heavily studied when it comes to tactics, training, military leadership. So please understand that there were lots of lessons learned from this war because of these tactics. They also demonstrated poor marksmanship. There's no way that 700 British should be able to walk 18 miles back to Boston and, not have the streets littered with dead British soldiers. That just shows that they couldn't. The Minutemen couldn't shoot very well at all. So the numbers don't lie. That's the data, right? So keep that in mind. They also, the one good thing about the Americans is they were very good at using intelligence. Look at how they found out in the first place. The doc, right? Dr. Joseph Warren. They were very good at establishing communication systems. They, had multiple riders. They just didn't put all their eggs in one basket. They used these postal express routes, these people that had excellent horse riding skills. Especially a 16-year-old girl doing that. Imagine a 16-year-old, any kid right now is 16 years old doing that. So you have to understand something is there were a lot of good things there that were demonstrated by the Americans. They also demonstrated the capability to mobilize and assemble quickly. This is extremely important when fighting in combat. You have to be able to mobilize quickly and move quickly in order to be able to counter the enemy threat wherever it is. And then the mission was a success, an absolute success for the Americans. Adams and Hancock were safe, right? The weapons and munitions were saved and redistributed amongst the people. And the Minutemen got some experience. And hopefully in the next battle, they definitely learned how to shoot in Bunker Hill because they had limited munitions and were able to hold the line there to almost 3 times. So I'm going to call it day for there. I'm going to jam out. Thank you for everybody for enjoying this lesson with me. And I will be making a couple more videos later on this week on some other different topics, right? So thank you very much. From downtown Phoenix, I am out. Peace.